Matt here, and this lesson is on Venn diagrams from the traditional or Aristotelian perspective. We've already covered Venn diagrams from the Boolean perspective, and now we need to cover the differences between the Boolean and the Aristotelian perspectives, mainly because of the difference in the two when it comes to existential import. It would be a good idea to review the video on existential import if you need to. So let's take a look at a universal affirmative proposition here. All snakes are reptiles. And we'll also draw the diagram for the E proposition right after that. No mammals are cold-blooded. Okay, from the Boolean perspective, all we had was shading in these diagrams, and that represented the fact that universal propositions from the Boolean standpoint do not have existential import. From the Aristotelian standpoint, however, if you recall, universal propositions about existing things do have existential import, and so we're going to represent that with the circled X. So for the A proposition, the circled X will go in the middle of the diagram, and the E proposition, the circled X will go on the left-hand side of the diagram. That's the only difference between the Aristotelian Venn diagrams and the Boolean Venn diagrams. As you'll notice here, we've got the I and the O propositions diagrammed with the X in the middle for the I proposition and the X on the left-hand side for the O proposition. Those two, the I and the O propositions, are identical with respect to both the Boolean and the Aristotelian perspective, so that doesn't change at all. The only thing that changes when we're diagramming propositions from the Aristotelian perspective are the A and the E propositions. Those diagrams, as you see, they have the shading just like the Boolean perspective, but now we've got that circled X to represent existential import. So the circled X is supposed to represent a conditional. The X represents something, or it denotes something, if the subject term actually exists. And if we've got a sentence with the subject term that doesn't exist, like a fire-breathing dragon or a hobbit, then there is no existential import. So the circled X is conditional. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. We can use these Venn diagrams to test immediate inferences, just like we did with the Boolean perspective. So a lot of what we'll be doing when we're testing immediate inferences with Venn diagrams is exactly the same as it was for the Boolean perspective. So again, if you need to review, go back and watch the video on testing immediate inferences from the Boolean perspective. The only difference will be when we have a premise, a universal premise, and a particular conclusion. So let's take a look at an immediate inference with a universal premise and a particular conclusion. So here P is our premise, all A are B. Our conclusion, some A are B. So I'm going to draw the diagram for both the premise and the conclusion, as you see here. Now, recall from the Boolean perspective, there was no X in the diagram for the universal proposition, the A proposition, all A are B. But now from the the Aristotelian perspective, we've got that circled X. If we were diagramming these from the Boolean perspective, they would be different. There would be no X in the premise diagram, and there would be an X in the conclusion diagram. And so I told you that those didn't match, and therefore this was an invalid inference. But as we know now, there are universal propositions that have existential import from the Aristotelian perspective. And to represent that, we use the circled X, like we saw earlier in this video. And in order to tell whether or not this is a valid inference, I drew the arrow connecting the X's. So these diagrams don't match exactly. But there is an implication here that makes this a valid inference. The X in the premise diagram is in the same spot as the X in the conclusion diagram. So the premise implies the existence of something in the right location that we have in the conclusion diagram. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is if you think about validity. If the premise is true, then that guarantees that the conclusion is also true, or it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Well, if it is true that there is something in that area of the diagram in the middle where the circles overlap, as we see in the premise, then it is also true that there's something in the area where the two circles overlap in our conclusion diagram. So the truth of the premise would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. But remember, the circled X in our premise diagram is conditional. It's conditional upon whether or not the subject term circle actually represents something that actually exists. In this case, we're using A and B as variables. So the diagram represents conditional validity. We do not know what A represents, so we don't know if A actually exists or not. So in this case, we'll have to leave this diagram as one that is conditionally valid. The condition that the validity depends on is whether or not A exists. So if A represents something that actually exists, then this will be a valid argument. If A does not represent something that actually exists, then it commits the existential fallacy and it is invalid. So that's how you test immediate inferences from the Aristotelian perspective. Everything else is exactly the same as the Boolean perspective. So let's try another one. As I'm writing this down, let me just remind you or I haven't told you yet, so let me tell you the steps that we're going to follow in order to test immediate inferences. You first should test the immediate inference from the Boolean perspective. If it's valid from the Boolean perspective, it's automatically valid from the Aristotelian perspective. The only time you need to retest it is when it is invalid from the Boolean perspective and you've got a universal premise and a particular conclusion like we have in this first one. So let's try another one. Our premise, no penguins are birds that can fly. Our conclusion, it is false that all penguins are birds that can fly. So we need to draw the Venn diagrams for the premise and for the conclusion, and we'll see whether or not this is a valid inference. The diagram for the premise looks much like the Boolean diagram for a universal negative proposition. We'll shade in the area where they overlap, but we also need our circled X in the area that is not shaded of the subject term. The conclusion is a statement that begins with, it is false that. And as we saw in the previous video on Venn diagrams, in order to diagram a proposition that begins with, it is false that, you must diagram the opposite of that premise or that proposition. Our conclusion is a universal affirmative proposition, and so the opposite of that would be a particular negative, or the O proposition, which can also be found on the diagonal of the square of opposition. So I have here diagrammed the particular negative diagram, which is the opposite of the all penguins are birds that can fly. So that's how you diagram the statement that begins with, it is false that. As we see, just like in the one above, the X, the circled X in the premise diagram is in the right part of the correct part of the Venn diagram, so that if that one is true, and if the X represents something that actually exists, then that will guarantee the truth of the conclusion or imply that there is something that exists in the circle that represents the subject term. So the diagram represents conditional validity, just like it did above, on the condition that the X represents something that actually exists. So the next step is ask yourself, well, does the circle on the left represent something that exists? Well, the P circle represents penguins, and penguins exist, so this is a valid argument. Again, let me repeat these steps that we're going to go through, because this is important. We first test the immediate inference from the Boolean perspective. If the argument or the immediate inference is valid from the Boolean perspective, it's automatically valid from the Aristotelian perspective. So that part doesn't change. The only thing that changes is when we have a universal premise and a particular conclusion. All of those immediate inferences are going to be invalid from the Boolean perspective. But with our new mark that we're going to be making, the circled X, we'll see that some of those arguments with universal premises and particular conclusions, like these two, might be valid if the circled X represents something that actually exists. Okay, so that's our steps. Let's try one more example, and hopefully this will give you a good idea of how to test immediate inferences from the Boolean perspective. Aristotelian perspective. All right, so our premise: all sugar plum fairies are flying things, and our conclusion: some sugar plum fairies are flying things. So this is another immediate inference that has a universal premise and a particular conclusion. If we were to test this from the Boolean perspective, which should be our first step whenever we're testing immediate inferences, we would have a premise diagram that does not match the conclusion diagram, because we would have shading in the left-hand side for the premise, and then we'd have an X in the middle of the diagram for the conclusion. So it's invalid from the Boolean perspective. We look again, since we have a universal premise and a particular conclusion, to see if this is going to be valid from the Aristotelian perspective. Well, our diagram represents conditional validity because our circled X in the premise is in the right spot. But in this case, the circle on the left represents sugar plum fairies, and sugar plum fairies do not exist. So while the diagram represents a conditionally valid inference, the condition that must be met is that the left-hand circle, the S circle, must represent something that actually exists. And in this case, it does not represent something that actually exists. So the condition is not met, and that means that this is an invalid inference. So remember our steps. Test the immediate inference from the Boolean perspective, like we did in the previous video. If it's valid from the Boolean perspective, it's automatically valid from the Aristotelian perspective. The only time where the Aristotelian and the Boolean perspectives are going to disagree is when we've got a universal premise and a particular conclusion. We retest it from the Aristotelian perspective with our circled X in the diagram for the universal premise. And if the circled X is in the correct spot, so it gives us this inference that there is an X in the conclusion diagram, then we'll have a diagram that is conditionally valid. The condition that must be met is that X represents something that actually exists. In the case of things like reptiles and penguins, the X represents something that does exist and will have a valid inference. In the case of sugar plum fairies or fire-breathing dragons, we will have an X that represents something that does not exist, and so the argument will be invalid. So that's how you test immediate inferences from the Aristotelian perspective with Venn diagrams.